Chapter 85 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre DUMAS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 85. News from Aurilly. On the following day, the king was working at the Louvre with the superintendent of finances, when an attendant entered to inform his majesty that Monsieur de Joyeuse, the eldest son of that family, had just arrived and was waiting for him in the large audience chamber, having come from Chicot Thierry with a message from Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou. The king precipitately left the business which occupied him, and ran to meet a friend whom he regarded with so much affection. A large number of officers and courtiers crowded the cabinet. The queen mother had arrived that evening, escorted by her maids of honor, and these light-hearted girls were like sons, always attended by their satellites. The king gave Joyeuse his hand to kiss, and glanced with a satisfied expression around the assembly. In the angle of the entrance door, in his usual place, stood Henry de Boussage, rigorously discharging his service and the duties which were imposed on him. The king thanked him and saluted him with a friendly recognition, to which Henry replied by a profound reverence. This good intelligence which prevailed between them made Joyeuse turn his head and smilingly look at his brother, without, however, saluting him in too marked a manner, for the fear of violating etiquette. "Sire," said Joyeuse, "I am sent to your majesty by Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou, recently returned from the expedition to Flanders." "Is my brother well, Monsieur l'Amiral?" inquired the king. "As well, sire, as the state of his mind will permit. However, I will not conceal from your majesty that he appears to be suffering greatly." "He must need something to change the current of his thoughts after his misfortune," said the king, delighted at the opportunity of proclaiming the check which his brother had met with, while appearing to pity him. "I believe he does, sire." "We have been informed that the disaster had been most severe." "Sire." "But that, thanks to you, a great portion of the army had been saved. Thanks, Monsieur l'Amiral, thanks. Does poor Monsieur d'Anjou wish to see us?" "Most anxiously so, sire." "In that case we will see him. Are not you of that opinion, madame?" said Henry, turning toward Catherine, whose heart was wrung with feelings, the expression of which her face determinedly concealed. "Sire," she replied, "I should have gone alone to meet my son, but since your majesty condescends to join with me in this mark of kind consideration, the journey will be a party of pleasure for me." "You will accompany us, messieurs," said the king to the courtiers. "We will set off tomorrow, and I shall sleep at Meaux." "Shall I announce this excellent news to Monseigneur, sire?" "Not so. What? Leave me so soon, Monsieur l'Amiral? Not so, indeed. I can well understand that a Joyeuse must be loved and sought after by my brother, but we have two of the same family, thank heaven. Du Boussage, you will start for Château Thierry, if you please." "Sire," said Henry, "may I be permitted, after having announced your majesty's arrival to Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou, to return to Paris?" "You may do as you please, Du Boussage," said the king. Henry bowed and advanced toward the door. Fortunately, Joyeuse was watching him narrowly. "Will you allow me to say one word to my brother?" he inquired. "Do so, but what is it?" said the king in an undertone. "The fact is that he wishes to use the utmost speed to execute the commission, and to return again immediately, which happens to interfere with my projects, sire, and with those of the cardinal." "Away with you, then, and rate this lovesick swain most roundly." Anne hurried after his brother, and overtook him in the antechambers. "Well," said Joyeuse, "you are setting off very eagerly, Henry." "Of course, my brother." "Because you wish to return here soon again?" "That is quite true." "You do not intend, then, to stay any time at Château Thierry?" "As little as possible." "Why so?" "Where others are amusing themselves is not my place." "On the contrary, Henry, it is precisely because Monseigneur le Duc d'Anjou is about to give some fetes that you should remain at Château Thierry." "It is impossible." "Because of your wish for retirement and of the austere projects you have in view?" "Yes." "You have been to the king to solicit a dispensation?" "Who told you so?" "I know it to be the case." "It is true, then, for I have been to him." "You will not obtain it." "Why so, my brother?" because the king has no interest in depriving himself of such a devoted servant as you are." "My brother, the cardinal will therefore do what his majesty will be disinclined to do." "And all that for a woman?" "Anne, I entreat you, do not persist any further." "Ah, do not fear that I shall begin over again, but once for all, let us to the point. You set off for Chateau Thierry. Well, instead of returning as hurriedly as you seem disposed to do, I wish you to wait for me in my apartments there. It is a long time since we have lived together. I particularly wish to be with you again, you understand." "You are going to Chateau Thierry to amuse yourself, Anne, and if I were to remain there, I should poison all your pleasures." "Oh, far from that. I do not care for them. I am of a happy temperament, and quite fitted to drive away all your fits of melancholy." "Brother—" "Permit me, comte," said the admiral, with an imperious air of command. "I am the representative of our father here, and I enjoin you to wait for me at Chateau Thierry. You will find out my apartment, which will be your own also. It is on the ground floor, looking out on the park." "If you command me to do so, my brother," said Henry, with a resigned air. "Call it by what name you please, comte, desire or command, but await my arrival." "I will obey you, my brother." "And I am persuaded that you will not be angry with me for it," added Joyeuse, pressing the young man in his arms. The latter withdrew from the fraternal embrace, somewhat ungraciously perhaps, ordered his horses, and immediately set off for Chateau Thierry. He hurried thither with the anger of a vexed and disappointed man; that is to say, he pressed his horses to the top of their speed. The same evening he was slowly ascending, before nightfall, the hill on which Chateau Thierry is situated, with the river Marne flowing at its feet. At his name the doors of the chateau flew open before him, but as far as an audience was concerned, he was more than an hour before he could obtain it. The prince, some told him, was in his apartments, others said he was asleep, he was practicing music, the valet de chambre supposed. No one, however, among the attendants could give a positive reply. Henry persisted, in order that he might no longer have to think of his service on the king, so that he might abandon himself from that moment to his melancholy thoughts unrestrained. Won over by his perseverance, it being well known, too, that he and his brother were on the most intimate terms with the duke, Henry was ushered into one of the salons on the first floor, where the prince at last consented to receive him. Half an hour passed away, and the shades of evening insensibly closed in. The heavy and measured footsteps of the Duc d'Anjou resounded in the gallery, and Henry, on recognizing them, prepared to discharge his mission with the accustomed formal ceremonies. But the prince, who seemed very much pressed, quickly dispensed with these formalities on the part of his ambassador, by taking him by the hand and embracing him. "Good day, comte," said he. "Why should they have given you the trouble to come and see a poor defeated general?" "The king has sent me, Monseigneur, to inform you that he is exceedingly desirous of seeing your highness, and that in order to enable you to recover from your fatigue, his majesty will himself come and pay a visit to Chateau Thierry tomorrow at the latest." "The king will be here tomorrow!" exclaimed Francois with a gesture of impatience, but recovering himself immediately afterwards. "Tomorrow, tomorrow," he resumed. "Why, the truth is that nothing will be in readiness, either here or in the town, to receive his majesty." Henry bowed, as one whose duty it had been to transmit an order, but whose province it was not to comment upon it. "The extreme haste which their majesties have to see your royal highness has not allowed them to think of the embarrassment they may be the means of occasioning." "Well, well," said the prince hurriedly, "it is for me to make the best use of the time I have at my disposal. I leave you, therefore, Henry. Thanks for the alacrity you have shown, for you have travelled fast, I perceive. Go and take some rest." "Your highness has no other orders to communicate to me?" Henry inquired respectfully. "None. Go and lie down. You shall dine in your own apartment. I hold no reception this evening. I am suffering and ill at ease. I have lost my appetite and cannot sleep, which makes my life a sad, dreary one, and which, you understand, I do not choose to inflict upon anyone else. By the by, have you heard the news?" "No, monseigneur. What news?" "Aurilly has been eaten up by the wolves." "Aurilly!" exclaimed Henry with surprise. "Yes, yes, devoured. It is singular how everyone who comes near me dies a violent death. Good night, count. May you sleep well." and the prince hurried away rapidly. End of chapter 85. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 86 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 86. Doubt. Henry descended the staircase, and as he passed through the antechambers, observed many officers of his acquaintance who ran forward to meet him, and with many marks of friendship offered to show him the way to his brother's apartments, which were situated at one of the angles of the chateau. It was the library that the Duke had given Joyeuse to reside in during his residence at Château Thierry. Two salons furnished in the style of Francois I communicated with each other and terminated in the library, the latter apartment looking out on the gardens. His bed had been put up in the library. Joyeuse was of an indolent yet of a cultivated turn of mind. If he stretched out his arms, he laid his hand on science; if he opened the windows, he could enjoy the beauties of nature. Finer and superior organizations require more satisfying enjoyments, and the morning breeze, the song of birds, or the perfume of flowers, added fresh delight to the triplets of Clement Marot, or to the odes of Rousard. Henry determined to leave everything as it was, not because he was influenced by the poetic sabbatism of his brother, but, on the contrary, from indifference, and because it mattered little to him whether he was there or elsewhere. But as the Count, in whatever frame of mind he might be, had been brought up never to neglect his duty or respect toward the king or the princes of the royal family of France, he inquired particularly in what part of the chateau the prince had resided since his return. By mere accident in this respect, Henry met with an excellent cicerone in the person of the young ensign, who, by some act of indiscretion or another, had, in the little village in Flanders where we represented the personages in this tale as having halted for a moment, communicated the Count's secret to the prince. This ensign had not quitted the prince's side since his return, and could inform Henry very accurately on the subject. On his arrival at Château Thierry, the prince had at first entered upon a course of reckless dissipation. At that time he occupied the state apartments of the chateau, had receptions morning and evening, and was engaged during the day stag hunting in the forest. But since the intelligence of Aurilly's death, which had reached the prince without its being known from what source, the prince had retired to a pavilion situated in the middle of the park. This pavilion, which was an almost inaccessible retreat except to the intimate associates of the prince, was hidden from view by the dense foliage of the surrounding trees, and could hardly be perceived above their lofty summits, or through the thick foliage of the hedges. It was to this pavilion that the prince had retired during the last few days. Those who did not know him well said that it was Aurilly's death which had made him betake himself to this solitude, while those who were well acquainted with his character pretended that he was carrying out in this pavilion some base or infamous plot, which some day or another would be revealed to the light. A circumstance which rendered either of these suppositions much more probable was that the prince seemed greatly annoyed whenever a matter of business or a visit summoned him to the chateau, and so decidedly was this the case, that no sooner had the visit been received or the matter of business been dispatched than he returned to his solitude, where he was waited upon only by the two old valets de chambre who had been present at his birth. "Since this is the case," observed Henry, "the fetes will not be very gay if the prince continue in this humor." "Certainly," replied the ensign, "for everyone will know how to sympathize with the prince's grief, whose pride as well as whose affections had been so smitten." Henry continued his interrogatories without intending it, and took a strange interest in doing so. The circumstance of Aurilly's death, whom he had known at court, and whom he had again met in Flanders, the kind of indifference with which the prince had announced the loss he had met with, the strict seclusion in which it was said that the prince had lived since his death, all this seemed to him, without his being able to assign a reason for his belief, as part of that mysterious and darkened web wherein, for some time past, the events of his life had been woven. "And," inquired he of the ensign, "it is not known, you say, how the prince became acquainted with the news of the death of Aurilly?" "No." "But surely," he insisted, "people must talk about it." "Oh, of course," said the ensign. "True or false, you know, people always will talk." "Well, then, tell me what it is." "It is said that the prince was hunting under the willows close beside the river, and that he had wandered away from the others who were hunting also, for everything he does is by fits and starts, and he becomes as excited in the fields as at play, or under fire, or under the influence of grief, when suddenly he was seen returning with a face scared and as pale as death. The courtiers questioned him, thinking that it was nothing more than a mere incident of the hunting field. He held 2 rouleaux of gold in his hand. "Can you understand this, messieurs?" he said in a hard, dry voice. "Aurilly is dead. Aurilly has been eaten by the wolves." Everyone immediately exclaimed. "Nay, indeed," said the prince. "May the foul friend take me if it be not so. The poor lute player had always been a far better musician than a horseman. It seems that his horse ran away with him, and that he fell into a pit, where he was killed. The next day a couple of travelers who were passing close to the pit discovered his body half eaten by the wolves, and a proof that the affair actually did happen, as I have related it, and that robbers have nothing whatever to do with the whole matter is, that here are the 2 rouleaux of gold which he had about him, and which have been faithfully restored." However, as no one had been seen to bring these 2 rouleaux of gold back, continued the ensign, it is supposed that they had been handed to the prince by the 2 travelers, who, having met and recognized his highness on the banks of the river, had announced the intelligence of Aurilly's death. "It is very strange," murmured Henry. "And what is more strange still," continued the ensign, "is that it is said— can it be true, or is it merely an invention? It is said, I repeat, that the prince was seen to open the little gate of the park close to the chestnut trees, and that something like 2 shadows passed through the same gate. The prince then introduced 2 persons into the park, probably the 2 travelers. It is since that occasion that the prince has retired into his pavilion, and we have only been able to see him by stealth." "And has no one seen these 2 travelers?" asked Henry. "As I was proceeding to ask the prince the password for the night, for the sentinels on duty at the chateau, I met a man who did not seem to me to belong to his highness's household, but I was unable to observe his face, the man having turned aside as soon as he perceived me, and having let down the hood of his cloak over his eyes." "The hood of his cloak, do you say?" "Yes, the man looked like a Flemish peasant, and reminded me, I hardly know why, of the person by whom you were accompanied when we met out yonder." Henry started. The observation seemed to him in some way connected with the profound and absorbing interest with which the story inspired him. To him, too, who had seen Diana and her companion confided to Aurilly, the idea occurred that the 2 travelers who had announced to the prince the death of the unfortunate lute player were acquaintances of his own. Henry looked attentively at the ensign. "And when you fancied you recognized this man, what was the idea that occurred to you, monsieur?" he inquired. "I will tell you what my impression was," replied the ensign. "However, I will not pretend to assert anything positively. The prince has not, in all probability, abandoned all idea with regard to Flanders. He therefore maintains spies in his employ. The man with the woolen overcoat is a spy who, on his way here, may possibly have learned the accident which had happened to the musician, and may thus have been the bearer of 2 pieces of intelligence at the same time." "That is not improbable," said Henry thoughtfully. "But what was this man doing when you saw him?" "He was walking beside the hedge which borders the parterre. You can see the hedge from your windows, and was making toward the conservatories." "You say, then, that the 2 travelers, for I believe you stated there were 2— "Others say that 2 persons were seen to enter, but I only saw one, the man in the overcoat." "In that case, then, you have reason to believe that the man in the overcoat, as you describe him, is living in the conservatories." "It is not unlikely." "And have these conservatories a means of exit?" "Yes, count, toward the town." Henry remained silent for some time. His heart was throbbing most violently, for these details, which were apparently matters of indifference to him, who seemed throughout the whole of this mystery as if he were gifted with the power of prevision, were in reality full of the deepest interest for him. Night had in the meantime closed in, and the 2 young men were conversing together without any light in Joyeuse's apartment. Fatigued by his journey, oppressed by the strange events which had just been related to him, unable to struggle against the emotions which they had aroused in his breast, the count had thrown himself on his brother's bed, and mechanically directed his gaze toward the deep blue heavens above him, which seemed set as with diamonds. The young ensign was seated on the ledge of the window, and voluntarily abandoned himself to that listlessness of thought, to that poetic reverie of youth, to that absorbing languor of feeling which the balmy freshness of the evening inspires. A deep silence reigned throughout the park and the town. The gates were closed, the lights were kindled by degrees. The dogs in the distance were barking in their kennels at the servants, on whom devolved the duty of shutting up the stables in the evening. Suddenly the ensign rose to his feet, made a sign of attention with his head, leaned out of the window, and then, calling in a quick, low tone to the count, who was reclining on the bed, said, "Come, come." "What is the matter?" Henry inquired, arousing himself by a strong effort from his reverie. "The man! The man!" "What man?" "The man in the overcoat, the spy." "Oh!" exclaimed Henry, springing from the bed to the window and leaning on the ensign. "Stay," continued the ensign. "Do you see him yonder? He is creeping along the hedge. Wait a moment, he will show himself again. Now look toward that spot which is illuminated by the moon's rays. There he is! There he is!" "Yes." "Do you not think he is a sinister-looking fellow?" "Sinister is the very word," replied Du Bouchage in a gloomy voice. "Do you believe he is a spy?" "I believe nothing, and yet I believe everything." "See, he is going from the prince's pavilion to the conservatories." "The prince's pavilion is in that direction, then?" inquired Du Bouchage, indicating with his finger the direction from which the stranger appeared to be proceeding. "Do you see that light whose rays are trembling through the leaves of the trees?" "Well?" "That is the dining-room." "Ah!" exclaimed Henry. "See, he makes his appearance again." "Yes, he is no doubt going to the conservatories to join his companion. Did you hear that?" "What?" "The sound of a key turning in the lock." "It is singular," said Du Bouchage. "There is nothing unusual in all this, and yet—" "And yet you are trembling. You were going to say—" "Yes," said the count, "but what is that?" The sound of a bell was heard. "It is the signal for the supper of the prince's household. Are you going to join us at supper, count?" "No, I thank you. I do not require anything, and if I should feel hungry, I will call for what I may need." "Do not wait for that, monsieur, but come and amuse yourself in our society." "Nay, nay, it is impossible." "Why so?" "His Royal Highness almost directed me to have what I should need served to me in my own apartment, but do not let me delay you." "Thank you, count. Good evening. Do not lose sight of our phantom." "Oh, rely on me for that, unless," added Henry, who feared he might have said too much, "unless, indeed, I should be overtaken by sleep, which seems more than probable, and a far more healthy occupation than that of watching shadows and spies." "Certainly," said the ensign laughingly, as he took leave of Henry du Bouchage. Hardly had he quitted the library than Henry darted into the garden. "Oh," he murmured, "it is Remy, it is Remy. I should know him again in the darkness of hell itself." And the young man, as he felt his knees tremble beneath him, buried his burning forehead in his cold, damp hands. "Good heavens!" he cried, "is not this rather a fantasy of my poor fevered brain? And is it not written that in my slumbering and in my waking moments, day and night, I should ever see those two figures who have made so deep and dark a furrow in my life? Why," he continued, like a man aware of the need that exists of convincing himself, "why indeed should Remy be here in this chateau, while the Duc d'Anjou is here? What is his motive in coming here? What could the Duc d'Anjou possibly have to do with Remy? And why should he have quitted Diana, he who is her eternal companion? No, it is not he." Then again, a moment afterward, a conviction, thorough, profound, almost instinctive in its nature, seemed to overcome all the doubts he had entertained. "It is he, he murmured, in utter despair, and leaning against the wall to save himself from falling. As he finished giving utterance to this overpowering, overwhelming thought, which seemed to crush all others in his mind, the sharp sound of the lock was again heard, and, although the sound was almost imperceptible, his overexcited senses detected it instantly. An indefinable shudder ran through the young man's whole frame. Again he listened with eager attention. So profound a silence reigned around him on every side that he could hear the throbbings of his own heart. A few minutes passed away without anything he expected making its appearance. In default of his eyes, however, his ears told him that someone was approaching, for he heard the sound of the gravel under the advancing footsteps. Suddenly the straight black line of the hedge seemed broken. He imagined he saw upon this dark background a group still darker moving along. "It is he returning again," muttered Henry. Is he alone, or is someone with him?" The objects advanced from the side where the silver light of the moon had illuminated a space of open ground. It was at the very moment when, advancing in the opposite direction, the man in the overcoat crossed this open space, that Henry fancied he recognized Remy. This time Henry observed two shadows very distinctly. It was impossible he could be mistaken. A death-like chill struck to his heart, and seemed to have turned it to marble. The two shadows walked quickly along, although with a firm step. The former was dressed in a woolen overcoat, and at the appearance of the second apparition, as that of the first, the count fancied he recognized Remy. The second, who was completely enveloped in a large man's cloak, seemed to defy every attempt at recognition. And yet, beneath that cloak, Henry fancied he could detect what no human eye could have possibly seen. He could not control a deep, bitter groan of despair, and no sooner had the two mysterious personages disappeared behind the hedge than the young man darted after them, and stealthily glided from one group of trees to another, in the wake of those whom he was so anxious to discover. "Oh," he murmured as he stole along, "do I not indeed deceive myself? Oh, heaven! Can it really be possible?" End of chapter 86. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 87 of The 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre DUMAS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 87. Certainty. Henry glided along the hedge on the side, which was thrown into deep shade, taking care to make no noise either on the gravel or against the trees. Obliged to walk carefully, and while walking to watch carefully over every movement he made, he could not perceive anything, and yet by his style, his dress, his walk, he still fancied he recognized Remy in the man who wore the overcoat. Mere conjectures, more terrifying for him than realities, arose in his mind with regard to this man's companion. The road which they were following, and which was bounded by a row of elms, terminated in a high hawthorn hedge which separated from the rest of the park the pavilion of the Duc d'Anjou, and enveloped it as with a curtain of verdure, in the midst of which, as has been already observed, it entirely disappeared in a remote corner of the grounds of the chateau. There were several beautiful sheets of water, dark underwood, through which winding paths had been cut, and venerable trees, over the summits of which the moon was shedding its streams of silver light, while underneath the gloom was thick, dark, and impenetrable. As he approached this hedge, Henry felt that his heart was on the point of failing him. In fact, to transgress so boldly the prince's orders, and to abandon himself to a course of conduct as indiscreet as it was rash, was the act not of a loyal and honorable man, but of a mean and cowardly spy, or of a jealous man driven to extremities. But as, while opening the gate which separated the greater from the smaller park, the man he followed moved in such a way that his features were revealed, and as he perceived that these features were indeed those of Remy, the count's scruples vanished, and he resolutely advanced at all hazards. Henry found the gate again closed. He leaped over the railings, and then continued his pursuit of the prince's two strange visitors, who still seemed to be hurrying onward. Another cause of terror was soon added, for the duke, on hearing the footsteps of Remy and his companion upon the gravel walk, made his appearance from the pavilion. Henry threw himself behind the largest of the trees and waited. He could not see anything, except that he observed that Remy made a very low salutation, that Remy's companion courtesied like a woman, instead of bowing like a man, and that the duke, seemingly transported with delight, offered his arm to the latter, in the same way as he would have done to a woman. Then all three advanced toward the pavilion, disappeared under the vestibule, and the door closed behind them. "This must end," said Henry, "and I must seek a more convenient place, where I can see everything that may pass without being seen." He decided in favor of a clump of trees, situated between the pavilion and the wall, from the center of which the waters of a fountain gushed forth, thus forming an impenetrable place of concealment, for it was not likely that in the night time, with the freshness and humidity which would naturally be found near this fountain, the prince would seek the vicinity of the water in the thickets. Hidden behind the statue with which the fountain was ornamented, and standing at his full height behind the pedestal, Henry was enabled to see what was taking place in the pavilion, the principal window of which was quite open before him. As no one could, or rather as no one would, venture to penetrate so far, no precautions had been taken. A table was laid, sumptuously served with the richest viands, and with rare wines in bottles of costly Venetian glass. 2 seats only at this table seemed to be awaiting 2 guests. The duke approached one of the chairs, then, leaving the arm of Remy's companion and pointing to the other seat, he seemed to request that the cloak might be thrown aside, as, although it might be very serviceable for an evening stroll, it became very inconvenient when the object of the stroll was attained, and when that object was a supper. Thereupon the individual to whom the invitation had been addressed threw the cloak upon a chair, and the dazzling blaze of the flambeaux lighted up, without a shadow on their loveliness, the pale and majestically beautiful features of a woman whom the terrified eyes of Henry immediately recognized. It was the lady of the mysterious house in the Rue d'Augustin, the wanderer in Flanders. In one word, it was that Diana whose gaze was as mortal as the thrust of a dagger. On this occasion she wore the apparel of her own sex, and was richly dressed in brocaded silk. Diamonds blazed on her neck, in her hair, and on her wrists, and thereby made the extreme pallor of her face more remarkable than ever, and in the light which shone from her eyes it almost seemed as if the duke had, by the employment of some magical means, evoked the ghost of this woman, rather than the woman herself. Had it not been for the support afforded by the statue round which he had thrown his arms, colder even than the marble itself, Henry would have fallen backward headlong into the basin of the fountain. The duke seemed intoxicated with delight. He fixed his passionate gaze upon this beautiful creature, who had seated herself opposite to him, and who hardly touched the dishes which had been placed before her. From time to time Francois leaned across the table to kiss one of the hands of his silent guest, who, as pale as death, seemed as insensible to his kisses as if her hand had been sculptured in alabaster, which, for transparency and perfect whiteness, it so much resembled. From time to time Henry started, raised his hand to his forehead, and with it wiped away the death-like sweat which rose on it, and asked himself, "Is she alive or dead?" The duke tried his utmost efforts and displayed all his powers of eloquence to unbend the rigid beauty of her face. Remy, the only attendant, for the duke had sent everyone away, waited on them both, and occasionally, lightly touching his mistress with his elbow as he passed behind her chair, seemed to revive her by the contact and to recall her to life, or rather to the position in which she was placed. Thereupon a bright flush spread over her whole face, her eyes sparkled, she smiled as if some magician had touched a spring unknown to this automaton-like figure, seemingly endowed with intelligence, and the mechanism of which had drawn the lightning glance from her eyes, the glowing flush on her cheek, and the sparkling smile to her lips. The moment after, she again subsided into her calm and statue-like stillness. The prince, however, approached her, and by the passionate tone of his conversation, seemed as if he had succeeded in warming into animation his new conquest. Thereupon Diana, who occasionally glanced at the face of a magnificent clock suspended over the prince's head, against the opposite side of the wall to where she was seated, seemed to make an effort over herself, and with her lips bedecked with smiles took a more active part in the conversation. Henry, concealed in his leafy covert, wrung his hands in despair, and cursed the whole creation in the utter wretchedness of his sore distress. It seemed to him monstrous, almost iniquitous, that this woman, so pure and rigidly inflexible, should yield herself so unresistingly to the prince, because he was a prince, and abandon herself to love because it was offered within the precincts of a palace. His horror at Remy was so extreme that he could have slain him without remorse, in order to see whether so great a monster had the blood and heart of a man in him. In such paroxysms of rage and contempt did Henry pass the time during the supper, which to the Duc d'Anjou was so full of rapture and delight. Diana sang. The prince, inflamed by wine and by his passionate discourse, rose from the table for the purpose of embracing Diana. Every drop of blood seemed to curdle in Henry's veins. He put his hand to his side to see if his sword were there, and then thrust it into his breast in search of a dagger. Diana, with a strange smile, which most assuredly had never, until that moment, had its counterpart on any face, stopped the duke as he was approaching her. "Will you allow me, Monseigneur," she said, "before I rise from the table, to share with your Royal Highness one of those tempting-looking peaches?" And with these words she stretched out her hand toward a basket of gold filigree work, in which 20 peaches were tastefully arranged, and took one. Then, taking from her girdle a beautiful little dagger with a silver blade and a handle of malachite, she divided the peach into 2 portions, and offered one of them to the prince, who seized it and carried it eagerly to his lips, as though he would thus have kissed Diana's. This impassioned action produced so deep an impression on himself that a cloud seemed to obscure his sight at the very moment he bit into the fruit. Diana looked at him with her clear, steady gaze and her fixed, immovable smile. Remy, leaning his back against a pillar of carved wood, also looked on with a gloomy expression of countenance. The prince passed one of his hands across his forehead, wiped away the perspiration which had gathered there, and swallowed the piece that he had bitten. This perspiration was most probably the symptom of a sudden indisposition, for while Diana ate the other half of the peach, the prince let fall on his plate what remained of the portion he had taken, and with difficulty rising from his seat, seemed to invite his beautiful companion to accompany him into the garden in order to enjoy the cool night air. Diana rose, and without pronouncing a single word, took the duke's arm which he offered her. Remy gazed after them, particularly after the prince, whom the air seemed completely to revive. As she walked along, Diana wiped the small blade of her knife on a handkerchief embroidered with gold, and restored it to its shagreen sheath. In this manner they approached the clump of trees where Henry was concealed. The prince, with a passionate gesture, pressed his companion's arm against his heart. "I feel better," he said, "and yet I hardly know what heavy weight seems to press down on my brain. I love too deeply, madame, I perceive." Diana plucked several sprigs of jasmine and of clematis, and 2 beautiful roses which bordered the whole of one side of the pedestal of the statue behind which Henry was shrinking terrified. "What are you doing, madame?" inquired the prince. "I have always understood, monseigneur," she said, "that the perfume of flowers was the best remedy for attacks of giddiness. I am gathering a bouquet with the hope that this bouquet, if presented by me, will have the magical influence which I wish it to possess." But while she was arranging the flowers, she let a rose fall from her hand, which the prince eagerly hastened to pick up. The movement that Francois made was rapid, but not so rapid, however, but that it gave Diana sufficient time to pour upon the other rose a few drops of a liquid contained in a small gold bottle, which she drew from her bosom. She then took from his hand the rose which the prince had picked up, and placing it in her girdle, said, "That one is for me. Let us change." And in exchange for the rose which she received from the prince's hand, she held out the bouquet to him. The prince seized it eagerly, inhaled its perfume with delight, and passed his arm around Diana's waist. But this latter action, in all probability, completely overwhelmed the already troubled senses of the prince, for his knees trembled under him, and he was obliged to seat himself on a bank of green turf, beside which he happened to be standing. Henry did not lose sight of these 2 persons, and yet he had a look for Remy also, who in the pavilion awaited the termination of this scene, or rather seemed to devour every minute incident of it. When he saw the prince totter, he advanced toward the threshold of the pavilion. Diana, on her side, perceived Francois stagger, sat herself down beside him on the bank. The giddiness from which Francois suffered continued on this occasion longer than on the former. The prince's head was resting on his chest. He seemed to have lost all connection in his ideas and almost the perception of his own existence, and yet the convulsive movement of his fingers on Diana's hand seemed to indicate that he was instinctively pursuing his wild dream of love. At last he slowly raised his head, and his lips being almost on a level with Diana's face, he made an effort to touch those of his lovely guest, but as if unobservant of the movement, she rose from her seat. "You are suffering, monseigneur," she said. "It would be better if we were to go in." "Oh, yes, let us go in," exclaimed the prince in a transport of joy. And he arose, staggering to his feet. Then, instead of Diana leaning on his arm, it was he who leaned on Diana's arm, and thanks to this support, walking with less difficulty, he seemed to forget fever and giddiness too, for suddenly drawing himself up, he, in an unexpected manner, pressed his lips on her neck. She started, as if, instead of a kiss, she had received the impression of a red-hot iron. "Remy!" she exclaimed, "a flambeau! A flambeau!" Remy immediately returned to the salle à manger, and lighted by the candle on the table a flambeau which he took from a small round table, and then, hurrying to the entrance to the pavilion and holding the torch in his hand, he cried out, "Here is one, madame." "Where is your highness going to?" inquired Diana, seizing hold of the flambeau and turning her head aside. "Oh, we will return to my own room, and you will lead me, I venture to hope, madame," replied the prince in a frenzy of passion. "Willingly, monseigneur," replied Diana, and she raised the torch in the air and walked before the prince. Remy opened, at the end of the pavilion, a window through which the fresh air rushed inward, in such a manner that the flame and smoke of the flambeau, which Diana held, were carried back toward Francois's face, which happened to be in the very current of the air. The 2 lovers, as Henry considered them to be, proceeded in this manner, first crossing a gallery to the duke's own room, and disappeared behind the fleur-de-lis hangings, which served the purpose of a portière. Henry had observed everything that had passed with increasing fury, and yet this fury was such that it almost deprived him of life. It seemed as if he had no strength left except to curse the fate which had imposed so cruel a trial upon him. He had quitted his place of concealment, and in utter despair, his arms hanging by his side and with a haggard gaze, he was on the point of returning, with life ebbing fast, to his apartment in the chateau, when suddenly the hangings behind which he had seen Diana and the prince disappear were thrown aside, and Diana herself rushed into the supper-room and seized hold of Remy, who, standing motionless and erect, seemed only to be waiting her return. "Quick, quick!" she said to him, "all is finished." And they both darted into the garden as if they had been drunk, or mad, or raging with passion. No sooner did Henry observe them, however, than he seemed to have recovered all his strength. He hastened to place himself in their way, and they came upon him suddenly in the middle of the path, standing erect, his arms crossed, and more terrible in his silence than anyone could ever have been in his loudest menaces. Henry's feelings had indeed arrived at such a pitch of exasperation that he would readily have slain any man who would have ventured to maintain that women were not monsters sent from hell to corrupt the world. He seized Diana by the arm and stopped her suddenly, notwithstanding the cry of terror which she uttered, and notwithstanding the dagger which Remy put to his breast, and which even grazed his flesh. "Oh, doubtless you do not recognize me," he said furiously, gnashing his teeth. "I am that simple-hearted young man who loved you, and whose love you would not return, because for you there was no future, but merely the past. Ah! Beautiful hypocrite that you are, and you, foul liar! I know you at last. I know and curse you. To the one I say, I despise and condemn you. To the other, I shrink from you with horror." "Make way!" cried Remy in a strangled voice. "Make way, young fool, or if not—" "Be it so," replied Henry. "Finish your work and slay my body, wretch, since you have already destroyed my soul." "Silence!" muttered Remy furiously, pressing the blade of his dagger more and more against Henry's breast. Diana, however, violently pushed Remy aside, and seizing Du Bouchage by the arm, she drew him straight before her. She was lividly pale, her beautiful hair streamed over her shoulders. The contact of the hand on Henry's wrist seemed to the latter cold and damp as the dews of death. "Monsieur," she said, "do not rashly judge of matters of which heaven alone can judge. I am Diana de Meridor, the mistress of Monsieur de Bussy, whom the Duc d'Anjou miserably allowed to perish when he could have saved him. 8 days since Remy slew Aurilly, the Duke's accomplice. The prince himself I have just poisoned with a peach, a bouquet, and a torch. Move aside, monsieur. Move aside, I say, for Diana de Meridor, who is on her way to the convent de hospitalieres." With these words, and letting Henry's arm fall, she took hold of that of Remy as he waited by her side. Henry fell on his knees, following the retreating figures of the two assassins, who disappeared behind the thick copse, as though it had been a vision from hell. It was not till fully an hour afterward that Du Bouchage, overpowered with fatigue and overwhelmed with terror, with his brain on fire, was able to summon sufficient strength to drag himself to his apartment. Nor was it until after he had made the attempt nearly a dozen times that he succeeded in escalading the window. He walked to and fro in his room several times, and then staggered toward the bed, on which he threw himself. Everyone was sleeping quietly in the chateau. End of chapter 87. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 88 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 88. Fatality. The next morning, about 9 o'clock, the beautiful rays of the sun were glistening like gold on the gravelled walks of Chateau Thierry. Numerous gangs of workmen, who had the previous evening been directed to be in attendance, had been actively at work from daybreak upon the preparations in the park, as well as in the decoration of the apartments destined to receive the king, whose arrival was momentarily expected. As yet nothing was stirring in the pavilion where the duke reposed, for he had on the previous evening forbidden his 2 old servants to awaken him. They were to wait until he summoned them. Toward 9:30, 2 couriers rode at full speed into the town, announcing His Majesty's near arrival. The civic authorities, the governor, and the garrison formed themselves in ranks on either side of the road, leaving a passage for the royal procession. At 10 o'clock the king appeared at the foot of the hill. He had mounted his horse when they had taken their last relays. He never neglected an opportunity of doing so, especially when entering towns, as he rode admirably. The queen mother followed him in a litter. 50 gentlemen belonging to the court, richly clad and admirably mounted, followed in their suite. A company of the guards, followed by Crillon himself, 120 of the Swiss, and as many of the Scotch guards commanded by Larchant, and all the members of the royal household who accompanied the king in his excursions, mules, coffers, and domestic servants, formed a numerous army, the files of which followed the windings of the road leading from the river to the summit of the hill. Lastly, the cortege entered the town amid the ringing of the church bells, the roar of cannon, and bursts of music. The acclamations of the inhabitants were enthusiastic, for a visit from the king was of such rare occurrence at that time that, seen thus closely, he seemed to be a living embodiment of the divine right. The king, as he progressed through the crowd, looked on all sides for his brother, but in vain. He only found Henry de Boussage waiting for him at the gate of the chateau. When once within the chateau, Henry III inquired after the health of the Duc d'Anjou from the officer who had assumed the high distinction of receiving the king. "Sire," replied the latter, "His Highness during the last few days has been residing in the pavilion in the park, and we have not yet seen him this morning. It is most probable, however, that as he was well yesterday, he is well also today." "This pavilion is in a very retired part of the park, it seems," said Henry in a tone of displeasure, "since the sound of the cannon does not seem to have been heard." "Sire," one of the duke's two aged attendants ventured to remark, "His Highness did not, perhaps, expect your Majesty so soon." "Old fool!" growled Henry. "Do you think, then, that a king presents himself in this way at other people's residences without informing them of it? Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou has been aware of my intended arrival since yesterday." And then, afraid of casting a gloom over those around him by a grave or sullen countenance, Henry, who wished to appear gentle and amiable at the expense of his brother Francois, exclaimed, "Well, then, since he has not come to meet us, we will go to meet him." "Show us the way there," said Catherine from the litter. All the escort followed the road leading to the old park. At the very moment that the guards who were in advance approached the hedge, a shrill and piercing cry rent the air. "What is that?" said the king, turning toward his mother. "Good heaven!" murmured Catherine, endeavoring to read the faces of those around her. "It sounded like a cry of distress or despair." "My prince, my poor master!" cried Francois's other aged attendant, appearing at the window and exhibiting signs of the most passionate grief. Everyone hastened toward the pavilion, the king himself being hurried along with the others. He arrived at the very moment when they were raising from the floor the Duc d'Anjou's body, which his valet de chambre, having entered without authority, in order to announce the king's arrival, had just perceived lying on the carpet of the bedroom. The prince was cold, stiff, and perfectly inanimate, and it was only by a strange movement of the eyelids and a nervous contraction of the lips that it could be observed that he was still alive. The king paused at the threshold of the door, and those behind him followed his example. "This is an ugly omen," he murmured. "Do not enter, my son, I implore you," said Catherine to him. "Poor Francois!" said Henry, delighted at being sent away, and thus being spared the spectacle of this agonizing scene. The crowd, too, followed the king as he withdrew. "Strange, strange," murmured Catherine, kneeling down by the side of the prince, or rather of the corpse, no one being in the room with her but the two old servants, and while the messengers were dispatched in every quarter of the town to find the prince's physician, and while a courier galloped off to Paris in order to hasten the attendance of the king's physicians, who had remained at Meaux with the queen. Catherine, with less knowledge, very probably, but not with less perspicacity than Miron himself, could possibly have examined the diagnostics of that singular malady which had struck down her son so suddenly. Her experience was by no means indifferent. In the first place, therefore, she interrogated calmly, and without confusing them, the two attendants who were tearing their hair and wringing their hands in the wildest despair. Both of them replied that the prince had returned on the previous evening about nightfall, after having been disturbed at an inconvenient hour by Monsieur de Boussage, who had arrived with a message from the king. They then added that when the audience had terminated, which had been held in the chateau itself, the prince had ordered supper to be prepared, and had desired that no one should venture to approach the pavilion without being summoned, and lastly, that he had given the strictest injunctions not to be awakened in the morning, and that no one should enter without a positive summons. "He probably expected a visit from a lady," observed the queen mother inquiringly. "We think so, madame," replied the valet respectfully, "but we could not discreetly assure ourselves of the fact." "But in removing the things from the table, you must have seen whether my son had supped alone." "We have not yet removed the things, madame, since the orders of Monseigneur were that no one should enter the pavilion." "Very good," said Catherine. "No one, therefore, has been here?"
"No one, madame."
"You may go." And Catherine was now left quite alone in the room. Leaving the prince lying on the bed where he had been placed, she immediately commenced the minutest investigation of each symptom, or of each of the traces to which her attention was directed, as the result of her suspicions or apprehensions. She had remarked that Francois's forehead was stained or dyed of a bistre color. His eyes were bloodshot and encircled with blue lines, his lips marked with furrows, like the impression which burning sulphur leaves on living flesh. She observed the same sign upon his nostrils and upon the sides of the nose. "Now let me look carefully," she said, gazing about her on every side. The first thing she remarked was the candlestick in which the flambeau which Remy had lighted the previous evening had burned away. "This candle has burned for a length of time," she said, "and shows that Francois was a long time in this room. Ah, here is a bouquet lying on the carpet." Catherine picked it up eagerly, and then, remarking that all its flowers were still fresh, with the exception of a rose which was blackened and dried up. "What does this mean?" she said. "What has been poured on the leaves of this flower? If I am not mistaken, I know a liquid which withers roses in this manner." She threw aside the bouquet, shuddering as she did so. "That explains to me the state of the nostrils and the manner in which the flesh of the face is affected, but the lips—" Catherine ran to the dining room. The valets had spoken the truth, for there was nothing to indicate that anything on the table had been touched since the previous evening's repast had been finished. Upon the edge of the table lay the half of a peach, in which the impression of a row of teeth was still visible. Catherine's attention was drawn to this in a particular manner, for the fruit, usually of a rich crimson near the core, had become as black as the rose and was discolored by violet and brown spots. The corrosive action was more especially visible upon the part which had been cut, particularly so where the knife must have passed. "This explains the state of the lips," she said. "But Francois had only bitten one piece out of this peach. He did not keep the bouquet long in his hand, for the flowers are still fresh. The evil may yet be repaired, for the poison cannot have penetrated very deeply. And yet, if the evil be merely superficial, why should this paralysis of the senses be so complete, and why indeed should the decomposition of the flesh have made so much progress? There must be more that I have not seen." And as she spoke, Catherine again looked all around her and observed, hanging by a silver chain to its pole, the red and blue parrot to which Francois was so attached. The bird was dead stiff, and the feathers of its wings rough and erect. Catherine again looked closely and attentively at the torch, with which she had once before already narrowly inspected, to satisfy herself that, by its having burned out completely, the prince had returned early in the evening. "The smoke," said Catherine to herself, "the smoke! The wick of that torch was poisoned. My son is a dead man." She called out immediately, and the chamber was in a minute filled with attendants and officers to the household. "Miron! Miron!" cried some of them.
"A priest!"
exclaimed the others. But Catherine had, in the meantime, placed to the lips of Francois one of those small bottles which she always carried in her alms bag, and narrowly watched her son's features to observe the effect of the antidote she applied. The duke immediately opened his eyes and mouth, but no glance of intelligence gleamed in his eyes, no voice or sound escaped from his lips. Catherine, in sad and gloomy silence, quitted the apartment, beckoning to the two attendants to follow her, before they had as yet had an opportunity of communicating with anyone. She then led them into another chamber, where she sat down, fixing her eyes closely and watchfully on their faces. "Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou," she said, "has been poisoned some time during his supper last evening, and it was you who served the supper." At these words the two men turned as pale as death.
"Torture us, kill us, if you will," they said, "but do not accuse us."
"Fools that you are! Do you suppose that if I suspected you, that would have been already done? You have not yourselves, I know, assassinated your master, but others have killed him, and I must know who the murderers are. Who has entered the pavilion?"
"An old man, wretchedly clothed, whom Monseigneur had seen during the last 2 days."
"But the woman?"
"We have not seen her. What woman does your majesty mean?"
"A woman has been here, who made a bouquet." The two attendants looked at each other with an expression of such simple surprise that Catherine perceived, by this glance alone, how perfectly innocent they were. "Let the governor of the town and the governor of the chateau be sent for," she said. The two valets hurried to the door. "One moment," exclaimed Catherine, fixing them in their places by this single word as they approached the threshold. "You only and myself are aware of what I have just told you. I shall not breathe a word about it. If anyone learns it, therefore, it will be from or through one of you. On that very day both your lives shall be forfeited. Now go." Catherine interrogated the two governors with more reserve. She told them that the duke had received from some person or persons a distressing intelligence which had deeply affected him, that alone was the cause of his illness, and that if the duke had an opportunity of putting a few further questions to the persons again, he would in all probability soon recover from the alarm into which he had been thrown. The governors instituted the minutest search in the town, the park, the environs, but no one knew what had become of Remy and Diana. Henry alone knew the secret, and there was no danger of his betraying it. Throughout the whole day, the terrible news, commented upon, exaggerated, and mutilated, circulated through Chateau Thierry and the province. Everyone explained, according to his own individual character and disposition, the accident which had befallen the duke. But no one, except Catherine and Du Bouchage, ventured to acknowledge that the chance of saving the duke's life was hopeless. The unhappy prince did not recover either his voice or his senses, or rather he ceased to give any sign of intelligence. The king, who was immediately beset with the gloomiest fancies, which he dreaded more than anything, would very willingly have returned to Paris, but the queen mother opposed his departure, and the court was obliged to remain at the chateau. Physicians arrived in crowds. Miron alone guessed the cause of the illness and formed an opinion upon its serious nature and extent, but he was too good a courtier to confess the truth, especially after he had consulted Catherine's looks. He was questioned on all sides, and he replied that Monsieur le Duc d'Anjou must certainly have suffered from some seriously disturbing cause, and had been subjected to some violent mental shock. In this way he avoided compromising himself, therefore, which is a very difficult matter in such a case. When Henry III required him to answer affirmatively or negatively to his question whether the duke would live, he replied, "I will answer your majesty in 3 days." "And when will you tell me?" said Catherine in a low voice. "You, madame, are very different. I will answer you unhesitatingly." "Well?" "Your majesty has but to interrogate me." "On what day will my son die, Miron?" "Tomorrow evening, madame." "So soon?" "Ah, madame," murmured the physician, "the dose was by no means a slight one." Catherine placed one of her fingers on her lips, looked at the dying man, and repeated in an undertone this sinister word, "Fatality." End of chapter 88. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 89 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 89. Les Hospitalieres. The count had passed a terrible night, in a state bordering on delirium and verging on death. Faithful, however, to his duty, as soon as he had heard the king's arrival announced, he rose and received him at the gate, as we have described. But no sooner had he presented his homage to his majesty, saluted respectfully the queen mother, and pressed the admiral's hand, than he shut himself up in his own room, not to die, but to carry determinedly into execution his long-cherished project, which nothing could any longer interfere with. Toward 11 o'clock in the morning, therefore, that is to say, as soon as immediately after the terrible news had circulated that the Duc d'Anjou's life was in imminent danger, everyone had dispersed, leaving the king completely bewildered by this fresh event. Henry went and knocked at his brother's door, who, having passed a part of the previous night travelling, had just retired to his own room. "Ah, is that you?" asked Joyeuse, half asleep. "What is the matter?" "I have come to bid you farewell, my brother," replied Henry. "Farewell? What do you mean? Are you going away?" "Yes, I am going away, brother, and nothing need keep me here any longer, I presume." "Why nothing?" "Of course, since the fetes at which you wished me to be present will not take place, I may now consider myself as freed from my promise." "You are mistaken, Henry," replied the Grand Admiral. "I have no greater reason for permitting you to leave today than I had yesterday." "I regret that it is so, but in that case, for the first time in my life, I shall have the misfortune to disobey your orders, and to fail in the respect I owe you, for from this very moment I declare to you, Anne, that nothing shall restrain me any longer from taking religious vows." "But the dispensation which is expected from Rome?" "I can await it in a convent." "You must be positively mad to think of such a thing. exclaimed Joyeuse, as he rose, with stupefaction depicted on his countenance. "On the contrary, my dear and honored brother, I am the wisest of you all, for I alone know what I am about." "Henry, you promised us a month." "Impossible." "A week, then? Longer?" "Not an hour." "You are suffering so much, then, poor boy?" "On the contrary, I have ceased to suffer, and that is why the evil is without a remedy." "But at all events, this woman is not made of bronze. Her feelings can be worked upon. I will undertake to persuade her." "You cannot do impossibilities, Anne. Besides, even were she to allow herself to be persuaded now, it is I who could no longer consent to love her." "Well, that is quite another matter." "Such is the case, however, my brother." "What? If she were now willing, would you be indifferent? Why, this is sheer madness." "Oh, no, no!" exclaimed Henry, with a shudder of horror. "Nothing can any longer exist between that woman and myself." "What does this mean?" inquired Joyeuse, with marked surprise. "And who can this woman really be? Come, tell me, Henry. You know very well that we have never had any secrets from each other." Henry trembled lest he had said too much, and that, in yielding to the feeling which he had just exhibited, he had opened a channel by means of which his brother would be able to penetrate the terrible secret which he kept imprisoned in his breast. He therefore fell into an opposite extreme, and, as it happens in such cases, and in order to recall the imprudent words which had escaped him, he pronounced others which were more imprudent still. "Do not press me further," he said. "This woman will never be mine, since she belongs to heaven." "Folly! Mere idle tales! This woman a nun? She has deceived you." "No, no, this woman has not spoken falsely. She is now an hospitaliere. Do not let us speak any further of her, but rather let us respect those who throw themselves at the feet of heaven." Anne had sufficient power over himself not to show the delight this revelation gave him. He continued, "This is something new, for you have never spoken to me about it." "It is indeed quite new, for she has only recently taken the veil, but I am sure that her resolution, like my own, is irrevocable. Do not therefore seek to detain me any longer, but embrace me, as you love me. Permit me to thank you for all your kindness, for all your patience, and for your unceasing affection for a poor heartbroken man. And farewell." Joyeuse looked his brother full and steadily in the face. He looked at him like one whose feelings had overcome him, and who relied upon a display of feeling to work upon the feelings of others. But Henry remained unmoved at this exhibition of emotion on his brother's part, and replied in no other way but by the same mournful smile. Joyeuse embraced his brother and allowed him to depart. "Go," he said to himself. "All is not yet finished, and however great your hurry may be, I shall not be long before I shall have overtaken you." He went to the king, who was taking his breakfast in bed, with Chicot sitting by his side. Good day, said the king to Joyeuse. "I am very glad to see you, Anne. I was afraid you would lie in bed all day, you indolent fellow. How is my brother?" "Alas, sire, I do not know. I am come to speak to you about mine." "Which one?" "Henry." "Does he still wish to become a monk?" "More so than ever." "And will he take the vows?" "Yes, sire." "He is quite right, too." "How so, sire?" "Because men go straight to heaven that way." "Oh," said Chicot to the king, "men go much faster still by the way your brother is taking." "Will your majesty permit me to ask a question?" "20, Joyeuse, 20. I am as melancholy as I can possibly be at Chateau Thierry, and your questions will distract my attention a little." "You know all the religious houses in the kingdom, sire, I believe?" "As well as I do a coat of arms." "Is there one which goes by the name of Les Hospitalieres, sire?" "It is a very small, highly distinguished, excessively strict and severe order, composed of 20 ladies, canonesses of Saint Joseph." "Do they take the vows there?" "Yes, as a matter of favor, and upon a presentation from the queen." "Should I be indiscreet if I were to ask your majesty where this order is situated?" "Not at all. It is situated in the Rue de Chevet Saint Landry, in the Cité, behind La Cloître Notre Dame." "At Paris?"
Yes.
Thank you, sire.
But what the devil do you ask me that for? Has your brother changed his mind, and instead of turning a Capuchin friar, does he now wish to become one of the hospitalieres?
No, sire, I should not think he would be so mad, after what your majesty has done me the honor to tell me. But I suspect he has had his head turned by someone belonging to that order, and I should consequently like to discover who this person is and speak to her.
Par la mordieu,
said the king with a self-satisfied expression.
Some 7 years ago I knew the superior of that convent, who was an exceedingly beautiful woman.
Well, sire, it may perhaps be the very one.
I cannot say since that time. I too, Joyeuse, have assumed religious vows myself, or nearly so indeed.
Sire, said Joyeuse, I entreat you to give me at any rate a letter to this lady, and my leave of absence for a couple of days.
You are going to leave me? Exclaimed the king. To leave me all alone here?
Oh, ungrateful king, said Chicot, shrugging his shoulders. Am I not here? My letter, if you please, sire, said Joyeuse. The king sighed, but wrote it notwithstanding.
But you cannot have anything to do at Paris,
said Henry, handing the note to Joyeuse. I beg your pardon, sire. I ought to escort, or at least to watch over, my brothers.
You are right. Away with you, but return as quickly as you can.
Joyeuse did not wait for this permission to be repeated. He quietly ordered his horses, and having satisfied himself that Henry had already set off, galloped all the way until he reached his destination. Without even changing his dress, the young man went straight to the Rue de Chevet Saint-Laudry. At the end of this street was the Rue d'Enfer, and parallel with it the Rue des Marmouzets, a dark and venerable-looking house, behind whose walls the lofty summits of a few trees could be distinguished, the windows of which were few, bad, barred, and a wicket at the side completed the exterior appearance of the Convent des Hospitalieres. Upon the keystone of the arch of the porch an artisan had rudely engraved these Latin words with a chisel: Matronae Hospites. Time had partially destroyed both the inscription and the stone. Joyeuse knocked at the wicket and had his horses led away to the Rue des Marmouzets, fearing that their presence in the street might attract too much attention. Then, knocking at the entrance gate, he said, "Will you be good enough to go and inform Madame la Supérieure that Monsieur le Duc de Joyeuse, Grand Admiral de France, is desirous of speaking to her on behalf of the king?" The face of the nun who had made her appearance behind the gate blushed beneath her veil, and she shut the gate. 5 minutes afterwards a door was opened, and Joyeuse entered a room set apart for the reception of visitors. A beautiful woman of lofty stature made Joyeuse a profound reverence, which the admiral returned gracefully and respectfully. "Madame," said he, "the king is aware that you are about to admit, or that you have already admitted, among the number of inmates here, a person with whom I require to speak. Will you be good enough to place me in communication with that person?" "Will you tell me the name of the lady you wish to see, monsieur?" "I am not aware of it." "In that case, then, how can I possibly accede to your request?" "Nothing is easier. Whom have you admitted during the last month?" "You either tell me too precisely, or with not sufficient precision, who this person is," said the superior, "and I am unable to comply with your wish." "Why so?" "Because during the last month I have received no one here until this morning."
"This morning?"
"Yes, Monsieur le Duc, and you can understand that your own arrival 2 hours after hers has too much the appearance of a pursuit to enable me to grant you permission to speak to her." "I implore you, madame." "Impossible, monsieur." "Will you merely let me see this lady?" "Impossible, I repeat. Although your name was sufficient for the doors of this house to be thrown open before you, yet, in order to speak to anyone here, except indeed to myself, a written order from the king is necessary." "Here is the order you require, madame," replied Joyeuse, producing the letter that Henry had signed. The superior read it and bowed. "His Majesty's will shall be obeyed," she said, "even when it is contrary to the will of heaven." And she advanced toward the courtyard of the convent. "You now perceive, madame," said Joyeuse, courteously stopping her, "that I have right on my side, but I fear I may be under a mistake, and therefore may be abusing the permission I have received from the king. Perhaps the lady may not be the one I am in search of. Will you be kind enough to tell me how she came here, why she came, and by whom she was accompanied?" "All that is useless, Monsieur le Duc," replied the superior. "You are under no misapprehension for the lady, who arrived only this morning, after having been expected for the last 15 days. This lady, I say, who was recommended by one who possesses the greatest authority over me, is indeed the very person with whom Monsieur le Duc de Joyeuse must wish to speak." With these words, the superior made another low courtesy to the duke and disappeared. 10 minutes afterwards she returned, accompanied by an hospitaliere, whose veil completely covered her face. It was Diana, who had already assumed the dress of the order. The duke thanked the superior, offered a chair to her companion, himself sat down, and the superior quitted the room, closing with her own hands the doors of the deserted and gloomy-looking apartment. "Madame," said Joyeuse, without any preface, "you are the lady of the Rue des Augustins, that mysterious person with whom my brother, Monsieur le Comte de Bouchage, is so passionately and madly in love." The hospitaliere bowed her head in reply, but did not open her lips. This affectation appeared to Joyeuse almost like an act of rudeness. He was already very indifferently disposed to his companion, and continued: "You cannot have supposed, madame, that it is sufficient to be beautiful, or to appear beautiful, to have no heart lying hidden beneath that beauty to inspire a wretched and despairing passion in the heart and mind of a young man of my name, and then one day calmly to tell him, 'So much the worse for you if you possess a heart, I have none, nor do I wish for any.'" "That was not my reply, monsieur, and you have been incorrectly informed," said the hospitaliere, in so noble and touching a tone of voice that Joyeuse's anger was in a moment subdued. "The actual words are immaterial, madame, when their sense has been conveyed. You have rejected my brother and have reduced him to despair." "Innocently, monsieur, for I have always endeavoured to keep Monsieur de Bouchage at a distance." "That is termed the art of coquetry, madame, and the result proves the fault." "No one has the right to accuse me, monsieur. I am guilty of nothing. Your feelings of irritation are aroused against me. I shall say no more." "Oh, oh!" said Joyeuse, gradually working himself into a passion. "You have been the ruin of my brother, and you fancy you can justify yourself with this irritating majesty of demeanour. No, no! The steps I have taken must show you what my intentions are. I am serious, I assure you, and you see by the trembling of my hands and lips that you will need some good arguments to move me." The hospitaliere rose. "If you have come here to insult a woman," she said, with the same calm self-possession, "insult me, monsieur. If, however, you have come to induce me to change my opinion, you are wasting your time and can withdraw." "Ha! You are no human creature!" exclaimed Joyeuse, exasperated. "You are possessed by an evil spirit." "I have already answered. I will reply no further. Since that is not sufficient, I shall withdraw." And the hospitaliere advanced toward the door. Joyeuse stopped her. "One moment! I have sought you for too long a period to allow you to leave me in this manner, and since I have succeeded in meeting with you, since your insensibility has confirmed me in the idea which had already occurred to me, that you are possessed by the foul fiend himself, sent hither by the enemy of mankind to destroy my brother, I wish to see that face whereupon the bottomless pit has written its blackest traces. I wish to behold the fire of that fatal gaze which bewilders men's minds. Avaunt thee, Satan!" And Joyeuse, making the sign of the cross with one hand as if he were exorcising her, with the other tore aside the veil which covered the face of the hospitaliere. The latter, silent and impassible, free from anger or ill feeling, fixed her sweet and gentle gaze upon him who had so cruelly outraged her, and said, "Oh, Monsieur le Duc, what you have just done is unworthy a gentleman." Joyeuse's heart was smitten by her reply. "Oh, madame," he murmured after a long silence, "you are indeed beautiful, and truly must Henry have loved you. Surely heaven can only have bestowed upon you loveliness such as you possess to cast it like perfume upon an existence devoted to your own." "Monsieur, have you not conversed with your brother? Or, if you have done so, he cannot have thought it expedient to make you his confidant. Had not that been the case, he would have told you that I have done what you say. I have loved. I shall never love again. I have lived, and must die." Joyeuse had never taken his eyes from Diana's face, and the soft and gentle expression of her gaze penetrated the inmost recesses of his being. Her look had destroyed all the baser material in the admiral's heart. The pure metal was alone left, and his heart seemed rent asunder, like a crucible which had been riven by the fusion of metal. Yes, yes, he repeated in a still lower voice, and continuing to fix upon her a gaze from which the fire of his fierce anger had disappeared. Yes, yes, Henry must have loved you. Oh, madame, for pity's sake, on my knees, I implore you to love my brother. Diana remained cold and silent. Do not reduce a family to despair. Do not sacrifice the future prospects of our race. Be not the cause of the death of one from despair and of others from regret. Diana, still silent, continued to look sorrowfully on the suppliant bending before her. "Oh!" exclaimed Joyeuse, madly pressing his hand against his heart. "Have mercy on my brother! Have mercy on me!" He sprung to his feet like a man bereft of his senses, unfastened, or rather tore open the door of the room where they had been conversing, and, bewildered and almost beside himself, fled from the house toward his attendants, who were awaiting him at the corner of the Rue d'Enfer. End of chapter 89. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 90 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre DUMAS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 90. His Highness Monseigneur le Duc de Guise. On Sunday the 10th of June, toward 11 o'clock in the day, the whole court were assembled in the apartment leading to the cabinet in which, since his meeting with Diana de Meridor, the Duc d'Anjou was dying by slow but sure degrees. Neither the science of the physicians, nor his mother's despair, nor the prayers which the king had desired to be offered up, had been successful in averting the fatal termination. Miron, on the morning of this same 10th of June, assured the king that all chance of recovery was hopeless, and that Francois d'Anjou would not outlive the day. The king pretended to display extreme grief, and turning toward those who were present, said, "This will fill my enemies full of hope." To which remark the queen mother replied, "Our destiny is in the hands of heaven, my son." Whereupon Chicot, who was standing humbly and reverently near Henry III, added in a low voice, "Let us help heaven when we can, sire." Nevertheless, the dying man, toward 11:30, lost both color and sight. His mouth, which up to that moment had remained open, became closed. The flow of blood which for several days past had terrified all who were near him, as the bloody sweat of Charles IX had similarly done at an earlier period, had suddenly ceased, and hands and feet became icy cold. Henry was sitting beside the head of the couch whereupon his brother was extended. Catherine was standing in the recess in which the bed was placed, holding her dying son's hand in hers. The Bishop of Château-Thierry and the Cardinal de Joyeuse repeated the prayers for the dying, which were joined in by all who were present, kneeling and with their hands clasped reverently together. Toward midday, the dying man opened his eyes. The sun's rays broke through a cloud and inundated the bed with a flood of light. Francois, who up to that moment had been unable to move a single finger, and whose mind had been obscured like the sun which had just reappeared, raised one of his arms toward heaven with a horror-stricken gesture. He looked all round the room, heard the murmuring of the prayers, grew conscious of his illness as well as of his weakness, became aware of his critical position, perhaps because he already caught a glimpse of that unseen and terrible future, the abode of certain souls after they have quitted their earthly prison. He thereupon uttered a loud and piercing cry, and struck his forehead with a force which made everyone tremble. Then, knitting his brows as if one of the mysterious incidents of his life had just recurred to him, he murmured, "Bussy! Diana!" This latter name had been overheard by none but Catherine, so weakened had the dying man's voice become before pronouncing it. With the last syllable of that name, Francois d'Anjou breathed his last sigh. At this very moment, by a singular coincidence, the sun which had gilded with its rays the royal arms of France, and the golden fleur-de-lis, which was again obscured, so that the fleur-de-lis, which had been so brilliantly illuminated but a moment before, became as dark and gloomy as the azure ground which they had but recently studded with constellations almost as resplendent as those whereon the eye of the dreamer rests in his upward gaze towards heaven. Catherine let her son's hand fall. Henry III shuddered, and leaned tremblingly on Chicot's shoulder, who shuddered too, but from a feeling of awe which every Christian feels in the presence of the dead. Miron placed a golden spatula on Francois's lips. After a few seconds he looked at it carefully and said, "Monseigneur is dead." Whereupon a deep, prolonged groan arose from the antechamber, like an accompaniment to the psalm which the cardinal murmured, "Cedant iniquitates mei ad vocem deprecationis meae." "Dead," repeated the king, making the sign of the cross as he sat in his fauteuil. "My brother, my brother!" "The sole heir of the throne of France," murmured Catherine, who, having quitted the bed whereon the corpse was lying, had placed herself beside the only son who now remained to her. "Oh," said Henry, "this throne of France is indeed large for a king without issue. The crown is indeed large for a single head. No children, no heirs. Who will succeed me?" Hardly had he pronounced these words when a loud noise was heard on the staircase and in the apartments. Nambu hurriedly entered the death chamber and announced, "His Highness, Monseigneur le Duc de Guise." Struck by this reply to the question which he had addressed to himself, the king turned pale, rose, and looked at his mother. Catherine was paler than her son. At the announcement of the horrible misfortune which mere chance had foretold to his race, she grasped the king's hand and pressed it as if to say, "There lies the danger, but fear nothing. I am near you." The son and mother, under the influence of the same terror and the same menace, had comprehended each other. The duke entered, followed by his officers. He entered holding his head loftily erect, although his eyes ranged from the king to the deathbed of his brother with a glance not free from a certain embarrassment. Henry III stood up, and with that supreme majesty of carriage which, on certain occasions, his singularly poetic nature enabled him to assume, checked the duke's further progress by a kingly gesture, and pointed to the royal corpse upon the bed, the covering of which was in disorder from his brother's dying agonies. The duke bowed his head and slowly fell on his knees. All around him, too, bowed their heads and bent their knees. Henry III, together with his mother, alone remained standing, and bent a last look, full of pride, upon those around him. Chicot observed this look, and murmured in a low tone of voice, "Desiceit potentes desede et exaltabit humilis." He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. End of chapter 90. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 91 of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia. Section 91. Postscript. A few words with reference to the principal characters in the novel of the 45 Guardsmen are necessary to complete the story. Diana de Montsoreau, having taken the vows at the Convent des Hospitalieres, survived the Duc d'Anjou only 2 years. Of Remy, her faithful companion, we hear no more. He disappeared without leaving a trace behind him. History, however, informs us more fully as to the others. The Duc de Guise, having at last broken into open rebellion against Henry III, was so far successful that with the aid of the League he compelled the king to fly from Paris. A hollow reconciliation was, however, patched up between them, the Duc de Guise stipulating that he should be appointed lieutenant general of the kingdom. But no sooner had the king returned to the Louvre than he determined on the assassination of the duke. He sounded Crillon, the leader of the 45, on the subject, but this noble soldier refused to have anything to do with it, offering, however, to challenge him to single combat. De Loignac was less scrupulous, and we know the result. The Duc de Guise and his brother the cardinal were both murdered. 10 days after this event, Catherine de Medicis, the queen mother, died, regretted by none. The Parisians, exasperated by the murder of the Duc de Guise, declared his brother, the Duc de Mayenne, the head of the League, and rose against the king, who was again obliged to fly.
He begged the King of Navarre for aid, who promptly responded to the call, and they were shortly before Paris with a united army of Catholics and Huguenots. Henry III was, however, pursued by the relentless hate of the clever and unscrupulous Duchesse de Montpensier. She worked so skillfully on the fanatical mind of the young Jacobin friar Jacques Clement that he undertook the death of the king. He entered the camp with letters for Henry, whom he stabbed while reading them. The king died on the 2nd of August, 1589, after having declared Henry of Navarre his successor. Of the subsequent life and adventures of Chicot, unfortunately, nothing authentic is known. End of section 91. End of the 45 Guardsmen by Alexandre Dumas. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia.